Welcome to episode 118 of Veeam's Industry Insights. In today's live stream, I am joined by a very special guest. Jason has time off for good behavior. He is out and about. But returning to the live stream again is our good friend Krista Macomber from Evaluator Group. Krista, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Dave. Thank you so much for having me today.
Well, always a pleasure. We really appreciate you joining us and love to decompose, get some of your thoughts on what is modern data protection. Before we launch into that, for those that may not be familiar with you, just want to mention a couple notions of your past and what you do. I know you previously published at eWeek, Tech Target, The Register. You've led some research practices at various other firms before joining Evaluator Group. We've got a slide we've prepared for you. And actually, the picture that we've got looks a lot like this morning. I have to tell you, it snowed overnight. It's lightly snowing right now here in Boulder, Colorado, where Evaluator Group is based. Krista, you're actually back east, though, but why don't you take us through what's your coverage area as senior analyst at Evaluator Group?
Sure, Dave. So I focus on anything and everything data protection and data security. So I was brought on about 3.5 years ago, really to kind of deep dive into this coverage because we've certainly seen a lot of interest and demand from IT operations that are looking to make sure they're cyber resilient and compliant and everything of that nature.
Outstanding, outstanding. Well, really appreciate you joining us. We'd love to do some pitch and catch with you because you've seen the industry from a few different vantage points now and over a long period of time. One of the things that Jason and I have been doing now for a number of weeks is unpacking some research that we've been doing. We've done it now for a few different years, and we always kind of dive in on one element of it. Today's element really is around what do organizations self-report as being important to them around modern data protection. We thought no one better than yourself to be able to jump in on some of that. What I thought we would do is share a little bit of that research. Love to get your reactions. I've got a couple of talking points, but love to hear what your thoughts are. Then we've got a sneak peek into some of the Evaluator Group's findings in trends in enterprise data protection that we're going to share with you as well. So without further ado, let me get the click here. This, what we're seeing now, I want to unpack. This is the only slide we're going to show, Krista, but from the research that Jason and Julie Webb and I have done, but we're going to kind of highlight it or hide portions of it and talk about it in a few different ways. This comes from a Data Protection Trends report, 4,200 organizations globally in 28 countries. We just asked the simple question here in white. What do you consider to be a defining aspect of modern or innovative data protection? Choose all that apply. Those are the longer bars. And then we stack ranked it by, if you had to choose one, what was the most important consideration for you? What would that be? You can see right away, one of the things I always like to do, Krista, is I'm a big pattern matcher. I think as engineers, we're often very visual. And if you just kind of look at this readout where we stack ranked by most important, kind of tight clustering, really. It's not like something's like 87% and another thing is, 4% at all. It means that for the vast majority of people that responded, over 4,000 in this case, there might be many different views of what's most important to them for modern or innovative. And as we see in the longer bars, certainly number of things. It's pretty equally weighted into the low to mid to high 30s across the board. So a lot of people looking for many things. And when it comes time for one thing, it's definitely some tight coupling in there. But before we kind of decompose this slide, just love to get your thought. Is there anything, that is either surprising to you or that you thought should make the list?
Yeah, Dave, I don't think anything particularly surprising, but what I do think is interesting is that we see topics of data security, automation, disaster recovery, kind of topping the list when we look at those items that are most important to customers. And I think that's interesting because typically when we think modern, a lot of the times the brain might go almost exclusively to, for instance, kind of cloud delivery for data protection or protecting cloud resources. And Certainly that's a part of the equation. I think really this kind of chart here shows that there's really a whole host of factors that go into what exactly is modern data protection.
Yeah, great comment on your part. I think if we were to have asked this question, pick your time frame a dozen years ago, you might have gotten very different responses. It might have been kind of more speeds and feeds oriented. Can you protect, 1,000 machines or whatever the case may be? To your point, backup and recovery has become more integrated, arguably, into more business processes, but more IT processes. And I like how you mentioned security. I think it's very interesting that from Evaluator Group practice, you look after both data security as well as backup and recovery or data protection. So if we kind of just click on this a little bit, what we notice, what rises to the top actually, is that notion of, I like to use the phrase, Krista, number one and number two here, it almost suggests that what's modern or innovative around data protection is playing better in the ecosystem, meaning, to your point, better able to integrate with a data security strategy, better able to automate recovery tasks, perhaps with systems management tools or automation tools of some kind. Mm-hmm. So if we kind of look at how people voted here, it's not sort of backup for backup's sake, is it?
It certainly isn't. Certainly I think we're seeing that there's greater awareness of the role that data protection and backup and recovery play in business continuity. So keeping critical applications and business services up and running. And I think really what's driving that awareness is that, there is this, kind of ransomware threat that we're all hearing about and talking about coming down the pike that is threatening that. And, I think data protection is certainly not the only element within that kind of, security stack, but it plays an important role when we think about being able to recover in the event of a cyber attack or, ideally helping to kind of mitigate the damage and uncover sooner, maybe that there has been some form of compromise.
Yeah, and I like how you mentioned the recovery notion, recover sooner. If I kind of change this shading a little bit, what we really see is, the ability to automate recoveries, to be able to orchestrate activity, and in some cases to definitely align better with the security strategy, or perhaps, unfortunately, in response to a security breach. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of an old phrase, Krista, but it's one I think is accurate, meaning when it comes to cyber infiltration, it's really not a matter of if, but when. And while that could sound almost kind of like a marketing phrase or a salesy phrase, if I kind of turn it around, I'd love to get your perspective on this. One, my belief is that we've got some data and we hear from people that they absolutely are getting breached. It doesn't matter if they're a Fortune 500 company. It does not matter their geography or what kind of business they're in. But also, if I just think about it from an engineering perspective, I think and love to get your view that we're really living in a time where we have to plan for failure. We have to plan for breach, in other words.
It's an unfortunate truth. And, I think, as you mentioned, it is sort of a marketing tagline, but there's certainly truth behind it. We are seeing that these breaches are happening, as you mentioned, Dave, globally across industries. And, the better prepared we are, is only going to better serve us in the long term, especially as these, attackers continue to evolve their approaches. So that's certainly where, as you mentioned, kind of integrating data protection processes as a part of those security functions becomes important. And then not to really jump the gun, but, the automation that you mentioned here. And I know, the second kind of element in the chart was regarding, being able to automate through integration with other systems management tools. Well, we're seeing that IT staff are very pressured, for time. This is one of the top challenges that they're facing today. So the more that can be streamlined, really the better prepared an organization can be to respond, especially given those kind of IT staff constraints.
Great point. Yeah. And now if we do sort of one more progressive revelation and highlight, I guess I would call this sort of the cloudy notion. I know you focus a great deal on the cloud. I think the last time that you visited us, you were talking about cloud-based protection in particular. But, cloud obviously means many things to many people, whether that's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, Is the cloud a destination, meaning a target for backups? Are we, lifting and shifting, whatever the case may be? Here was I thought was interesting is 4 different groupings of responses that collectively, if I do quick math, 21, 23, 33, 35, 45% of the most top rated, most important aspects around what's modern innovative. So nearly half at 45% are cloud and orientation. Does this jive with what you see, or do you think overall this is a little bit representative of a bit of a change in what we're seeing and how people are protecting their environments?
Yeah, Dave, I would have two kind of core comments here. And, before I jump into that, so I will be sharing towards the end of our discussion a few data points from some primary research that we did. And really, we found kind of two things. The first is that we are moving towards some maturity in the market in terms of being able to protect our SaaS applications, for example, like Microsoft 365, and, protect our infrastructure as a service workloads. Like AWS EC2, for instance. So that's, I think, one element of the equation is that we are seeing that customers are taking action there. And then the second part of the equation here is utilizing the cloud as a part of the data protection implementation. So, enabling DR to cloud infrastructure, kind of this first bar we've highlighted here. I mean, that's so important because customers do need that kind of failover environment. And so being able to utilize the cloud for infrastructure that's more readily accessible, really can help to solve that requirement or address that requirement for customers in a pretty big way. So certainly this jives with what we're seeing.
Excellent, excellent. So if we kind of recap a little bit, what were some of the main themes then? Definitely backup, not isolated and, operating independently, meaning part of your overall cybersecurity strategy. I like to say, Krista, at Veeam, we're unapologetically a backup company. We're not trying to suggest that we're a security company, but the reality is availability or data protection does play a role in a security response, does play a role in a good cybersecurity strategy and practice. And continuing along those themes, the notion backup is participatory in other parts of IT, other parts of the business. In some cases, whether that's better integrated with business continuity, disaster recovery, or systems management. I particularly like that, the notion of recovery and systems management, the rest of IT overall, so that backup isn't just an island. You can leverage that data for other use cases. And then what you just mentioned around cloud capabilities, whether that's protecting for reasons of is that infrastructure available or not, or is the SaaS application available but your data perhaps is compromised or not, or is it a destination, yet another tier for you to be able to send data to? But I know you've done a number of things as well in this space. I do want to tee up and, shout out to Krista and the Evaluator Group for sharing this data from their Trends in Enterprise Data Protection study that was just published. A couple of unique things here. Before we jump in, can you just tell us a little bit about this research?
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. So we fielded the study late last fall in 2022. And as you mentioned, we published early last month, January 2023. And really the intention here was to be able to put some data and numbers behind what are the influencers behind how customers are approaching their purchases for data protection. So specifically, what sorts of requirements are they looking for? And really, what challenges and pain points are they facing? We have kind of more qualitative conversations on a very regular basis with IT operations. But what we do like to do, as I mentioned, is periodically take a step back and be able to put some numbers behind that just to kind of give bigger context for ourselves, but also for our IT operations customers. So that was really the genesis of this particular research.
Outstanding. And so, I see one of the headlines is, staff or headcount constraints, particularly though in data protection, being a major challenge for a good portion of enterprises. I feel like staffing is always a challenge. CIOs have been saying this, self-reporting that for quite some time, literally decades. What were some of the thoughts or observations you heard around staffing as it relates to data protection?
Yeah, Dave, this was really interesting. So I should add as well that this particular research, we fielded a version of this study back in 2019 as well. So as you can imagine, the world has changed quite a bit since then. So we did make a number of changes to the study since then. And one change that I made was I actually added this option to the question when we asked about customers' top challenges with their data protection solutions. And, as we pointed out here, it actually ranked number 3. So it was noted
Wow.
by it was just under 30% of respondents selected this as, among their top data protection challenges. And I like to add the context as well that it only was secondary to issues regarding costs and budgets, which are always top of mind in the data protection space. It's always an area that unfortunately customers are really looking to kind of squeeze as much as they can out of their data. So to me, that was really telling that not only are we hearing about this in conversation, but it was showing up here in the data, kind of in these challenges. And I know we have a couple other areas we're going to touch on from the study, but from my perspective, it really was kind of a common theme that was very much influencing how customers were thinking about what they're going to be looking for their data protection solutions over the next couple of years.
Excellent. And you've got a couple things that we'll unpack here in terms of key observations. Maybe take us through this first one, because honestly, this was a little surprising to me. Not, I guess, if I stop and think about it, but just the number over 50% is pretty staggering.
Yes, yeah, it was pretty staggering. So we did ask about cybersecurity and cyber resiliency in a few different areas throughout this body of research. And that was because, as we've been talking about so far, Dave, certainly we're hearing about how this is, an issue impacting, customers, really across the globe. So one area that we asked about it was for customers that indicated they were intending to change their primary backup vendor. So this was not 50% of the respondents that answered the survey, but of the respondents that said they were thinking about changing their primary backup vendor, we did want to understand what their motivators were. And, again, over 50% said the ability to improve cyber resiliency was a top reason. And I think that's I think that comes from a couple of areas. So, you referenced kind of, the CIO and kind of some of the pain points around, staffing and addressing security requirements. And I think even looking just outside of the CIO's office as well, IT operations and data protection teams are facing pressure from all different angles to, guarantee that they're going to kind of be able to mitigate the impact of some of these ransomware attacks and really prove that the organization is prepared to be able to recover. So as a result of that, I think they are looking with more scrutiny at the technologies and the tools and the partners they have in place from the perspective of being able to meet those requirements.
Gotcha. Yep, totally makes sense. This next one, I have to admit, warms my heart. I'll tell you why. Selfishly, meaning from a Veeam perspective afterwards. We don't do too much of a Veeam commercial, but I will give a little plug in here. But one of your next key takeaways was something that it lines up well with some of the results that Jason and I saw as well.
Yep, absolutely. I know we were just talking about this on the prior slide, Dave, and so we talked about automation as a whole, and when we frame it in the context of disaster recovery, I think it becomes even more important from two perspectives. And I think the first is maybe a little bit more apparent up front, and certainly the more that DR can be automated, the faster, at least in theory, the faster that the organization should be able to recover, right? So I think that's kind of the first angle here, if you will. But the second component as well, which I know Veeam can do as well, is the ability to, sort of test disaster recovery and do that in an automated way as well. That becomes very important, especially when we think about being prepared for, really cyber attacks, but really any other, kind of disaster, if you will, that would require some sort of recovery. For instance, this is something that we heard about in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic as well in the early days back in the spring of 2020. Many folks I spoke with on the IT operations side, admitted to me that they were not as prepared, their organization was not as prepared as they thought they were going to be able to, utilize some of their data copies and things of that nature to facilitate their remote working. And so all of a sudden, the ability to kind of test those DR processes and do it at scale became very important. So this, I think, has a number of different applications that become very important.
Yeah, one of the stories that I think I may have shared with you, off camera, Krista, at different locations, not just even today, but I don't think I've ever mentioned on now going on 3 years on the live stream is the importance of automation around disaster recovery and the importance of having automation that you can believe in, that documentation's up to date, that ideally is well validated, meaning pre-tested, and possibly even to respond to cyber resiliency. One of the stories I like to share with that is in the United States, in Northern California, Sacramento area, a few years back now, there were major fires, and certainly a lot of the world has experienced major fires recently. But there was one large IT group, and their CIO said even though the fires were very close to their data center, he was going to hold off as long as he could to declare a disaster. And the reason why is because he didn't have confidence in his disaster recovery plan. And I kid you not, no joke, they looked out the windows and they could see fire and smoke, and they were going to wait forever in their mind, as long as they possibly could, because the threat of what they could look out and even smell was less than what they thought might be if they were to enact a plan that they just didn't fully believe in. So this is a real concern. Now you add in cyber as well, where, now instead of just recovering a portion of your data or a business process, you could have to recover literally 100% of your production data. So I guess in that regard, it's not surprising that this crept up, but I'm actually happy to see. I'm unhappy for the reasons driving this, but happy to see that you're getting results that people are really pretty aware of this, that they're in tune with how automation can play a role. I like your third data point here as well. I mean, we've talked about cloud, and certainly as an industry, we've talked about cloud. But tell us about this one, because I said greater than 50% was a pretty good number. Well, about 80% is a really high number.
Yeah, yeah. And this was one of the figures that really jumped out to me from the study. And, candidly was even a little bit higher than maybe I would have even expected. So we asked customers about the various ways in which they are using the cloud to support their data protection functions. So that could be a backup as a service model where they're, subscribing to their backup software in a cloud hosted model. It also could be using the cloud as a storage target, whether that be for their backups or even for longer term retention. And yeah, as you mentioned, Dave, about 80% said the cloud is playing a role in their data protection function. So I think that really, to me, it kind of ties back in large part to the first comment that we have on the slide here, regarding those staffing pressures. So the more that things like, day-to-day maintenance of infrastructure, for example, can be sort of offloaded to that cloud service provider, all of that is just going to help to give more time back to IT operations for them to be able to, strategize and support the business in, a high value way, like, navigating these cyber resiliency requirements, for example. I know compliance is one thing too. All the compliance regulations are continuing to change. But so that's really, I would say, a big driver behind the usage of cloud is really to be able to, kind of streamline those operations and kind of address that, that kind of complexity and kind of staff challenge issue. But also, for some customers, they're looking at the cloud to be able to move more to an OpEx model. Of course, and we could have a whole separate, conversation, Dave, about the different dynamics that come to play in the cloud, because just because you move to the cloud certainly does not mean it's less expensive than, on premises. But, there certainly is the option to go more to sort of a transactional model. So I would say that's another, another element that's driving some of the interest in the usage in the cloud as well.
Outstanding. Before I move off of this slide, definitely want to give a shout out. You can see the name of the report, Trends in Enterprise Data Protection 2023, an update to the 2019 research that Krista mentioned. You can also see there kind of in the lower left, Evaluator Group, simple to find, www.evaluatorgroup.com. Encourage you to check that out. Speaking of checking things out, Evaluator Group is also really busy and active in the industry. And now, thankfully, with live shows coming back, and some of them hybrid, of course, as well. But here are 3 shows upcoming that Evaluator Group is going to be at. Maybe take us through a little bit of this.
Sure, Dave. Thank you. Yep. So a number of our team members are going to be at, attending these shows coming up in the spring. So as you referenced, we do have MemCom coming up at the end of March out in Mountain View, California. We have the NAB show. I know we attend that every year. That's in the middle part of April. And also we'll be at KubeCon in Europe. That one will be actually overlapping a little bit with the NAB show. That one will be overseas in Amsterdam. I know that I personally attended the last KubeCon. That was in Detroit this past fall. And that certainly was a really enjoyable and interesting experience to talk about everything that's happening with the Kubernetes space that's just developing so quickly.
Yeah, and shout out to the Evaluator Group, because in addition to MemCon and NAB, very active in the Flash Memory Summit, very active around the cloud native activity Evaluator Group is. KubeCon, for those not familiar with it, our good friend Michael Cade that we've had on a few times. KubeCon is an event that takes place every 6 months. It alternates between Europe and North America. As Krista mentioned, Amsterdam coming up here in April timeframe, and then 6 months after that, I believe it's Chicago is where it's going to be hosted. So be sure to check out Evaluator Group at these events. Last item I'll mention is, a lot of research we've been producing and highlighting in our live streams here. What we talked about today comes from the lower right, aspects from the Data Protection Trends Report. There's a QR code in there for that, or VEE.am/DPR23. That just means Data Protection Trends 23, as well as some of the other research we published around Salesforce, ransomware trends, cloud protection trends, etc. So as always, Krista, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for sharing a lot of your information that you've recently published at Evaluator Group. Everyone, thank you for joining us as well as we go on now 3 years of our streams. Until the next time, stay safe, stay positive, and we'll see you on the next live stream.